Good day. Today is Thursday, 11th September 2025, and I am not going to conceal the fact that I'm making this program today in a troubled and shocked mood following the tragic news from the United States yesterday. And of course, I am referring to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Now, when one makes programs like I do every day, and tries to stay on top of the news flow, it can be sometimes extraordinarily frustrating because one makes programs even as great events are taking place and the program comes out and it does so after the event, which one hasn't covered, has taken place. To be precise, there were 3 such news stories yesterday, and today I'm going to cover all 3 of them. But by far the most important of those 3, the one that, as I said, has left me profoundly shaken, is the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Now, Charlie Kirk is an individual. Every day, I think it's fair to say, absolutely every day, for the last 3.5 years, I have been seeing film, videos, especially of the conflict in Ukraine, in which I have seen people die. I've had to report in many places about the deaths of people, and every individual life carries equal weight. So why am I speaking about Charlie Kirk's death as indicating that it's had an even bigger impact than some of those other deaths? Well, the short answer is, firstly, because of the man, but also and mostly because of the circumstance. Let's talk first about the man. He has been described as a political activist. He has been described as a friend of the president and as a supporter of the president. He has been described as a commentator and as a debater. For me, the most important part of that is that he was a debater. He was somebody who went out and debated and did so continuously with people who disagreed with him. And he did so always, apparently, under the title, "Show Me Where I Am Wrong." And he would have many earnest and difficult debates, and sometimes it's accepted that he bested those he was debating, and sometimes he was himself bested in those debates, but he went on and he continued to do that. Now, for me, that is the essence of civilized and democratic politics. I know that there are people who disagree with some of Charlie Kirk's positions, but surely no one can criticize his approach, the fact that he conducted, as I said, debate, that he engaged with the people that he disagreed with him, and he did so with restraint and politeness, qualities which have been vanishing in our lives, certainly in our political lives in the West, for some time now. And of course, he also, as somebody who had recently been a student, he was a young man of 31, recently married with children who have now been orphaned. Anyway, as a young man, he particularly engaged with the student community. He started his political work within the student community, and he often visited campuses where the student body would be expected to have different opinions from his own and would engage with students there. And of course, he was killed whilst he was addressing a large group of students at a campus in Utah. Now, I'm somebody who's had lots of connections with universities. My wife is an academic who is in a university. And as far as public debate is concerned, well, for me, universities have always been sacred spaces, though I ought to say that even that has been eroded significantly over the last 5 or so years. But anyway, he was assassinated there, and he was cut down at the precise moment when he was engaging with the students, and as far as I can see, participating in debates with them. Now, there has been much discussion about the motivations behind this killing, and of course the authorities have not yet arrested or captured the man who they believe is the assassin. And, well, I hope they do, and it is entirely possible that this individual, when he is caught, will be shown to have had, well, all kinds of different motives. But I nonetheless think that it is right to speak of this killing, whatever the motives of the killer, as a political act, as a political assassination, because of the circumstances in which it was carried out. A political activist, a debater, a commentator, killed in the middle of a meeting which was ultimately a political meeting, because this activist was engaging in dialogue with the other persons at this meeting, dialogue of a political nature. And that makes it already, in my opinion, a political killing. And, well, there has been, as many people say, an uptick of violence recently, political violence in the last few years, maybe the last 5 years especially, in the United States. But here we have had one, and it has been carried out in the most direct way. Now, here I will speak of another specific reason why, for me, this is a particularly shocking affair, because inevitably, when I heard about this killing, when I saw the film of it, it brought back to me the very first event, political event, that I remember in my life. When I was 7 years old in Greece, I heard about the assassination in the United States of Robert Kennedy. And I can say that for me was the day, if you will, when I began my own political journey, the one that has led me to the point where I am now. And there is something about the killing of Charlie Kirk yesterday and the killing of Robert Kennedy all those years ago in 1968, which to me makes these two events exactly similar. Because exactly in the same way that Charlie Kirk was assassinated whilst engaging in democratic politics, and there is no more democratic way to conduct politics than to engage in debates with your opponents, so Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968 whilst also engaging in democratic politics, and there is no better way to engage in democratic politics than to participate in democratic elections, which was what Robert Kennedy was doing. Now, I remember, I'm one of those people who has a clear memory of the 60s, the 1960s. I remember the extraordinary degree of political tension that existed at that time in the United States and elsewhere. The 1960s was scarred in the United States by a succession of political assassinations. There was the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. There was the assassination of Malcolm X. There was the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And there was the assassination of Martin Luther King. And there were, by the way, other killings at the same time in the United States at that time of people who are less well remembered than perhaps they should be. Now, that succession of assassinations changed the United States, and in my opinion, unequivocally did so for the worse. If none of those assassinations had taken place, if all of those four men that I've spoken of had survived the decade, then at the end of the 1960s, at the start of the 1970s, the United States would have been a different country, taking an entirely different direction from the one it did. And I fear that this assassination that has just taken place in the United States, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, is going to have, or could be the start of a similar process having the same effect. And I would say something further here. As somebody who remembers the 1960s and who is able to compare that decade with the decade today, I would say that we are in a far worse position to absorb political violence, the kind of political violence that was marked by those assassinations of the 1960s and the assassination of Charlie Kirk yesterday. We're in a far worse position to absorb that than we were back in the 1960s. Compared to today, the 1960s was a period of extraordinary stability. There was a war going on in Vietnam, and of course that was extremely divisive. There was the civil rights movement in the United States, which was divisive, but also a movement that contained with it great hope. But the overall story of the 1960s, of the United States at that time, was of extraordinary increase in material prosperity, a extraordinary cultural dynamism, tremendous confidence, an extraordinary sense of stability, and essentially stable relations between the two great powers of that era, the Soviet Union and the United States. Even if the Cold War was still underway, the two superpowers were at that time in continuous dialogue with each other. Ideas of arms control, of détente, were starting to gain traction, and the overall condition of the world appeared stable in a way that simply is unimaginable to us today. And even then, that succession of assassinations in the United States in the 1960s caused things, as I say, to turn out much worse than they had been. What can one say of assassinations carried out in the far more fractious, far more partisan, far more angry, far more depressed conditions of today? Well, this is what I'm going to say about this program today. I have to say that, as I said, I was deeply shocked and upset. As somebody who has become a father relatively recently, I ache with sorrow at the thought of Charlie Kirk's children who have just been deprived of their father and of his wife, and of his family, and of their friends. I wish them the best. I wish them God bless to all of them. I will remember Charlie Kirk. I will remember him with admiration and affection, as much, as I said, for his political praxis as for his ideas, not all of which, I should say, I shared. And, well, I think the world today is a darker, more ominous place than it was yesterday. Anyway, let me now move on to the other topics of this program. Now, I said that there were certain other things that had happened over the last couple of hours, things that happened before my video was published yesterday, but after I had made it, and which I did not know about when I made that video. Well, can I first of all perhaps begin with the drone episode that took place yesterday, the Russian drones that crossed the border into Poland. After discussing Charlie Kirk and the assassination and what happened, returning to this topic feels a little bit like going from the sublime to the ridiculous, but I suppose I must deal with it. Now, in the hours that have passed, the media in the West, various political leaders in the West, Prime Minister Tusk of Poland, other political leaders in Poland, though interestingly not so much the newly elected president of Poland, Mr. Nawrocki, and of course predictably all of the leaders of the European powers and President Zelensky have combined to claim that the drone incident, the crossing of 19 or some say 20 or even 21 drones onto Polish territory from Ukrainian territory, Russian drones, the crossing of these drones was some kind of threatening action against Europe by Russia's president, Vladimir Putin. It is always Putin who supposedly makes all of these decisions. He apparently is the only person who decides or does anything of a political nature. In Russia, we talk about him all of the time, ignoring the fact that there's 144, is it more than that, million people living in Russia at this time. But anyway, put that aside. Now, if Vladimir Putin really wanted to threaten Europe and the West, if he wanted to send some forceful message to the West, would he really have done it by sending inert decoy drones? The proposition, actually, when one unpacks it, is completely ridiculous. It is absurd. These drones, and the Polish authorities have confirmed that there isn't a trace of explosive has been found in any of the locations where these drones fell. These drones are cheap products made mostly from plastics, simple plastics. They carry primitive, very basic electronics and a simple engine, as one would expect for drones that are intended purely and exclusively as decoys. Surely, if Vladimir Putin really wanted to scare the West, if he really wanted to send some kind of threatening message to the West, he wouldn't have done it in this way. He's got Iskander missiles, and Oreshnik missiles and Kinjal missiles and Zircon missiles. He's got all of these weapons in abundance. You could send KH-101s. He's got bombers. He's got submarines. He's got every conceivable kind of weapon that you can imagine in his arsenal. And out of all of that vast arsenal, he decides to threaten the West with decoy drones made of plastic and fiberglass, which contain no explosive. It's like trying to threaten the entire Western alliance by waving a broom at them, or if you prefer, floating a balloon in their direction. I'm sorry if I'm making this all sound flippant, but again, I think that one needs to see the absurdity of this to understand how ridiculous that whole argument is. And nonetheless, we hear that Poland, the Polish government, Prime Minister Tusk, is now busy contacting all the other European leaders. He's busy contacting President Trump in the United States. He's invoking, well, apparently there was some talk that he might invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, the part of the treaty, the article in the treaty that is that covers situations where one country has been the target of an armed attack, but wiser counsels prevailed in NATO, and he was apparently told to invoke the lesser article, Article 4 instead. But anyway, he's invoking Article 4. He's going to have hurried consultations, and he is going to also, well, he has also insisted upon a meeting of the United Nations Security Council to discuss this attack, this armed attack by unarmed drones upon his country. So there's going to be a meeting of the Security Council, and this is going to take place apparently on Friday. I suspect that some of the members of the Security Council from the Global South, mindful of the attack that has just taken place by the Israelis on the Qatari capital of Doha, will be shaking their heads in astonishment and dismay, and will be saying to themselves again that these people in the West have taken leave of their senses. Now, yesterday, when I touched on this topic, I suggested a theory of my own, and I want to stress this was only a theory. I think I said that at the time, but briefly, it was that these were decoy drones, that the Russians had carried out a massive attack using missiles and drones, geran drones, on targets in western Ukraine, including the city of Lvov. One of those targets, as the Russians claim, was a factory that refurbishes armoured vehicles. That seems to be the main target. Anyway, I suggested that as decoy drones often work alongside the geran drones, in fact, that's precisely what they are designed to do. I suggested that maybe, perhaps as a result of electronic jamming, some of these drones were diverted from their courses, or perhaps they weren't shot because they weren't shot down, and they are not programmed to come down and hit a particular point in the way that the geran drones are, that they just went on flying towards Poland and crossed the border and eventually were either shot down and crashed inside Poland. That was my theory yesterday. And I still think that this is a real possibility, by the way. But after I made my video, the Russian Defense Ministry made certain comments about what had happened, and they were very interesting, and it is to those comments that I now propose to go. Now, firstly, the Russian Defense Ministry provided a detailed account of the entire drone and missile strike that took place in relation to the attack on Ukraine. Firstly, the Russian Defense Ministry gave a detailed account of the drone and missile strike which took place, explaining what targets were hit and that kind of thing, which I'm not going to repeat in this program. But then the Russian Defense Ministry went on to say this: the goals of the strike were achieved. All the assigned targets were engaged. There were no intentions to engage any targets on the territory of Poland. The maximum flight range of the Russian drones used in the strike, which allegedly crossed the border with Poland, does not exceed 700 kilometers. Nevertheless, we are ready to hold consultations on this subject with the Polish Defense Ministry. A short time later, the Russian Foreign Ministry published its own statement, which supported and repeated the statement of the Russian Defense Ministry. Now, this statement requires a certain degree of unpacking. Firstly, the Russians, in effect, are not disputing that the drones that reached and crossed into Poland are Russian drones. That is not something that the Russians are disputing at all. They are also, and this I think needs to be said, they are also not accusing the Ukrainians of launching the drones or of engaging in a false flag. There is no word about that in this statement from the Russian Defense Ministry. What the Russian Defense Ministry is saying is, look, yes, these do look like our drones. We understand that some of these drones landed in Poland. We generally don't understand how that can have happened because these drones, as far as we know, don't have the range to reach Poland and to cross into Polish territory and to move deep inside Polish territory. So we are as puzzled by this as perhaps the Poles should be. And we are offering to sit down with you in Poland and talk about this. And that way we can find out together how this happened and if it was indeed our drones which went inadvertently into Polish territory, well then perhaps we're prepared to apologize, and if any damage was done, we might be willing to pay compensation. That is what the Russian Defense Ministry is saying. It is not making any accusations against anybody, not against the Poles, not against the Ukrainians either. Now, that does leave open the possibility that the theory I outlined provides an explanation for what happened. Now, here I will address briefly the question of the 700-kilometer range of the drones, which is what I think a lot of people have seized on and what the Russian Defense Ministry has mentioned. Now, I am not an expert in drones. I am not an expert in the engine systems that drones have. But I do know that sometimes with vehicles, it can happen that they turn out to have a longer range than their stated designated range appears to be. And it could be that the drones, the engines on the drones, these particular decoy drones, were expected to last for just 700 kilometers, but there might have been an error. It might be that their range is actually greater than that, or it could be that this particular batch of drones, if they all came from a single batch, has some quirk in the engine which meant that they just went on flying for rather longer than the Russians expected. I personally know of such things. I want to stress, I am not saying that that was what happened in this case. And then, of course, there are other factors about which I am far less informed, even than that, and cannot really comment in any expert way about, and that is that maybe wind direction might have played a role in making the drones go further than they were expected to go. Maybe they were moved along by gusts of wind or something of that kind. Atmospheric conditions might have played a role. None of this, it seems to me, is excluded by this statement by the Russian Defense Ministry. But there is an alternative theory which is circulating on the internet and, by the way, on the Russian media as well. And it is a theory which has appeared in places like Radovka, for example, Russian media outlet, and which you do find in the Russian media as well. And that is that, of course, these drones, these particular drones, as I said, they're not intended to strike targets. They don't have targets. They don't carry explosive. When the engine runs out of fuel, they simply come down to earth. They're light. They can often suffer only superficial damage when they land on the earth. And the Russians have been conducting massive drone attacks across Ukraine for months now. And geran drones and these particular types of drones have been in use for some time too. And it is quite likely that the Ukrainian landscape is littered with examples of these drones which have crashed to earth. And the theory that some people are circulating is that the Ukrainians, wanting to create an incident, collected some of these drones and refurbished them and installed new engines in them and themselves launched them into Poland with the purpose of creating tensions between Russia and Poland. In other words, as part of some kind of false flag operation. Now, here I am going to say something, which is that, first of all, there is no information in existence that refutes that theory. At least none that I am aware of. The Ukrainians, it seems to me, have the means to do this. I mean, these drones are there, the ones that crashed. They probably can get hold of large numbers of these drones, some of which probably have suffered only slight damage. They probably only need minor tweaking and refurbishment, and they could do this. They certainly have the organization to do this kind of thing. Recently, they conducted drone attacks deep inside Russia against Russian strategic air bases. An intelligence operation, a covert operation that is capable of organizing and carrying out an attack of that kind could certainly put together, refurbish a couple of drones, a dozen or a score of drones, and launch them towards Russia. So it's not impossible. And the Ukrainians have shown a certain tendency in the past to engage in activities that are not unlike this. A lot of people have drawn attention to the fact that I think it is either in 2022, I think it was in 2022 or early 2023, a Ukrainian air defense missile, an S-300. We know it was a Ukrainian air defense missile because the British media, interestingly, are now in passing, admitting to that fact. Anyway, a Ukrainian air defense missile, an S-300, landed on Polish territory, and for some days afterwards, the Ukrainians claimed that it was a Russian missile attack on Poland, and they put an enormous amount of pressure on Poland to act, to respond against the supposed armed attack on Poland by the Russians. And it's a reasonable guess that they knew all along that it was one of their own aircraft, one of their own missiles, and for that reason, we saw that they were manipulative and duplicitous with their information then, and there's no reason to think that they wouldn't be exactly the same. They couldn't be exactly the same now. So yes, the Ukrainians have the means to do this thing. Do they have the motive to do it? I would argue that they do. And here perhaps we should take a step back and consider the events of the last 6 weeks. 6 weeks ago, at the end of July, Vladimir Zelensky must have been in a relatively good mood. It appeared that President Trump was becoming increasingly angry with President Putin. He was making increasingly critical comments about Putin. He'd said that Russia had only 50 days to agree a ceasefire with Ukraine, and unless it did so within 50 days, then the United States would impose 100% sanctions on Russia and 100% sanctions on any country, including China and India, that continued to buy Russian oil. And this, of course, was exactly what Vladimir Zelensky wanted to hear. And as I said, I am guessing, but I suspect that at the end of July, even despite Russian advances on the battlefronts, Vladimir Zelensky overall was a happy man. And then from that point on, everything has gone wrong. Firstly, he will have discovered to his horror that instead of imposing sanctions in the way that he said against the Russians, Trump first arranged for his envoy, Steve Witkoff, to go to Moscow, then arranged a summit meeting with Putin in Alaska, then met Putin in Alaska, refusing to permit Zelensky himself to come to Alaska as well. And then directly after the meeting in Alaska, all further talk of sanctions, either on Russia or tariffs on Russia's trading partners, all that seemed to have been kicked into the long grass. It wasn't happening anymore. And the weeks that have followed have in some ways gone even worse. So Zelensky apparently was led to think that the United States might be willing to agree to Ukraine receiving certain types of security guarantees, that the United States was prepared to support some kind of military contingent from the NATO powers entering Ukrainian territory, that the United States was prepared to provide a backstop to the European powers that were going to provide that contingent to enter Ukrainian territory, a guarantee of some kind, that it might even be considering establishing some kind of no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. All those stories were circulating. And then there was a meeting about 10 days ago in Paris, and the meeting came up with no such plans. Zelensky made his frustration clear. He said that all of the discussions he was hearing were theoretical, they weren't practical, And then, of course, there was a further conversation on the same day with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as it turns out, was not giving out security guarantees or committing to backstops or doing any of those things. So Zelensky hadn't got his sanctions, and he hadn't got his security guarantees, and he hadn't got his European contingent, and he hadn't got his no-fly zone either. And then Macron, at that meeting, said that the question of the security guarantees that the United States would give would be sorted out over the next few days. And there have been several meetings this week discussing this very question in Washington, but there's been no word of the United States coming forward to offer security guarantees, either to Ukraine or backstops to the Europeans. And in the meantime, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has kicked into the long grass the whole idea of a summit meeting, a bilateral summit meeting between Zelensky and himself. He's even invited Zelensky to Moscow, which of course Zelensky's not prepared to do. And it turns out that all of the various attempts to pressure and badger the Americans to move forward with enormous sanctions against Russia or tariffs against Russia's trading partners, that all of those have been kicked into the long grass also. Now, 2 days ago, there was an article in the Financial Times, which I've already discussed in a previous video, which said that over the course of the meetings in Washington this week, President Trump told the Europeans that the United States would indeed impose 100% tariffs on Russia and 100% tariffs on Russia's trading partners, China and India, but only provided the Europeans were prepared to do the same. And I said in the video that where I discussed this Financial Times article, I said that looked to me like a device by President Trump to avoid having to impose these drastic sanctions and tariffs on on Russia, India, and China. President Donald Trump would be in a position to say, if, as he expected, the Europeans refused to impose 100% tariffs on India and China, that the United States could not be expected to do that which the Europeans were not doing. Well, yesterday, an article appeared in the Wall Street Journal which confirmed that the Europeans have now responded to the Americans, and they have confirmed that they are not prepared to impose 100% tariffs on India and China. They are not apparently willing either to give up entirely imports of Russian oil and, above all, Russian liquefied natural gas. Presumably, they understand that going down that path, doing that sort of thing, would be utterly ruinous to their economies. And I think Trump has always known that, and I think he has always known that the Europeans would not take that step, and the Europeans have now confirmed that they're not going to. So, where that leaves us, and where that leaves Zelensky, is that it now looks definitely as if the sanctions, the massive sanctions, and the tariffs against India and China, which he thought he had been promised in July, are not going to happen. So, Zelensky is now in a very difficult situation. Arms supplies from the West are reducing, not because the United States doesn't want to supply weapons to Ukraine, not because the Europeans don't want to supply weapons to Ukraine, but because inventories are so depleted that there are not enough weapons to send. Sanctions, the massive sanctions that he thought he had been promised back in July, are not being imposed either. Neither on Russia nor on its trade partners. The security guarantees that he thought he would get out of the various meetings that have taken place over the last couple of weeks have not crystallized. The European force that we've been hearing so much about looks most unlikely as if it will ever come. And even the proposals to confiscate the Russian assets, which have been talked about so much in the West, as I discussed extensively in my video yesterday, it looks like that isn't going to happen either. Ursula von der Leyen, the best she could come up with, in an extraordinary and dreadful speech, by the way, that she has just given. Anyway, Ursula von der Leyen has now come up with a new idea, which is to use the interest of these Russian assets to float some further 6 billion euro loan for Ukraine. 6 billion euros. By now, I am fairly certain that the interest is being used as security simultaneously for multiple loans, because, as I've already said, I simply don't see how the numbers otherwise add up. Regardless of that, Zelensky probably doesn't care about that. The point is, it's not more loans that he's looking for. It is a straight transfer of the capital, the entire $300 billion, and it is not coming. So one can imagine that Zelensky, who might have been in an optimistic mood in July, at the end of July, is in a desperate mood now. And I can completely imagine, since we're talking about the personality of Vladimir Zelensky, that he would come together with people like Budanov and the SBU chief and whoever else makes these decisions in Kiev, and say to them, look, we're really going down. The Russians are advancing on the battlefronts. Our armies are depleted. The Americans look like they're abandoning us. The Europeans are hopeless. We've got to do something urgently to get the Americans back into the game. So can you organize something? And they came back and said to him, yes, we got all of these drones, these decoy drones that are lying across the landscape. We can cobble them together. It won't take us long, probably no more than a couple of days or a week or perhaps 2 weeks at most. And we can recalibrate them and give them new engines and send them towards Poland. And we can spread the story that it is the Russians attacking Poland. So yes, I can imagine that Zelensky might think in that way. I watched him very carefully. He is the sort of person, in my opinion, who could authorize something like this. After all, he's quite unabashed about the fact that he is essentially ordered his intelligence agencies to conduct killings of people in Russia. So he's a pretty ruthless individual. It seems to me that he's not the kind of person who would necessarily balk from an operation of this kind, despite the very high risks if the Poles ever worked out what had actually happened. So we have the means, the opportunity, the Ukrainians would have just waited for the next big Russian drone and missile strike close to their western borders. They would have known that one was coming, and the opportunity came with the latest big Russian drone and missile strike. They had the means and the opportunity, and you could argue that they had the motive. All of this logical, but is it so? Everything that I have just been talking about is speculation. It may be plausible speculation. You can put it all together and accept the logic of this, but we have no evidence actually that it did in fact happen in this way, and the Russian Defense Ministry themselves are not saying that it did. Now, the fact that the Russians are not saying it doesn't mean, by the way, that it didn't. I can imagine that the Ukrainians might have conducted an operation of this kind. As I said, there would have been very considerable risks, but they've shown repeatedly that they're willing to take risks. They're prepared to take risks by shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, as the New York Times at one point admitted. They were prepared to take risks with the Kursk operation, which I believe, and the Russians believe, and the Ukrainians have never convincingly denied, was intended to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, the biggest in Europe, by the way. I can imagine that Zelensky, who's nothing if not a compulsive risk taker, might have been prepared to authorize an operation of this kind. But, to repeat again, there is no evidence yet for it. The Russians themselves have not accused the Ukrainians of doing it. Now, there is a simple way of getting to the truth of all of this. The truth can be found by the Russians and the Ukrainian and the Poles sitting down together and conducting a joint investigation. The Poles should be welcoming the offer by the Russians of contacts to discuss this incident. What do the Poles objectively have to lose by agreeing to it? They can meet with the Russians, they can talk to the Russians, they might be able to find out what had actually happened. If it was the Ukrainians doing something of the sort that I have just described, then that is an important fact. It's an important fact about Poland's Ukrainian ally, which the Poles themselves perhaps need to know about. Just saying. But if, as perhaps some would say is still more likely, this was all an accident, motors that went on running longer than people expected, or changes in the atmosphere and the wind which caused drones to move longer distances, or something of that kind. Well, if it was something like that, then objectively again, the Poles would benefit from knowing it and would be reassured by it. They would be reassured because they would know that they are not actually in Russia's sights and are not likely to come under attack. So everything that I have just said leads me now to this point. The best, most obvious, most logical thing for the Poles to do is to accept that offer from the Russian Defense Ministry to agree to sit down with the Russians and to find out what exactly it was that really happened. Will they do it? Well, of course they won't. Now, there is no unanimity in Poland about the conflict in Ukraine. I know that there are many people in Poland who have great doubts about this whole enterprise, not because they like the Russians, but because they think that Poland is overcommitted. They also perhaps are wary of getting into another conflict with Russia, as they should be. President Nawrocki has just been elected president of Poland, basically on a platform of minding about Poland, not becoming too involved in these foreign adventures. Prime Minister Tusk of Poland, who is fully signed up to Project Ukraine, he has been losing support in Poland. I suspect that if it was left to opinion in Poland, many people there would say, let's accept this Russian offer. Let's find out what actually happened, and then let's agree with the Russians a way forward so that it doesn't happen again. But of course it is not going to happen, because Keir Starmer, Friedrich Merz, Emmanuel Macron, Prime Minister Tusk, Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, none of them wanted to. Zelensky, of course, doesn't want it to happen either. Far better to promote the narrative, the absurd and ridiculous narrative of a Russian attack on Poland, in order to try to persuade Donald Trump to change his policy, to change his stance, to once again commit to some kind of, well, what exactly, I'm not even sure now, possibly some kind of plan to send more air defense systems, but there aren't any air defense systems. I mean, I don't know. But anyway, to get Donald Trump again to recommit to Ukraine, to provide Ukraine with more weapons or more sanctions, or do something of that kind. So that is what this incident is being used for. That's why it's getting all the publicity it is. That is why there are debates going to happen in, of all places, the UN Security Council. I've spent, in my opinion, an enormous amount of time discussing an incident of no fundamental importance. And, well, here it is where I'm going to stop. Let me say something. Over the last 3 days, there has actually been an important development in the diplomacy in Ukraine. That is what I touched on a little earlier when I said that Trump suggested to the Europeans that they impose sweeping tariffs on India and China and stop buying Russian oil and gas. And the Europeans came back and said no. This is big news. It means that sanctions have now run out of road. The whole sanctions bandwagon has run out of road. It's not going to go any further. The Russian economy is not going to collapse. There's no pressure on Russia, external pressure on Russia, such as Putin might have to take into account. There's not going to be external pressure on Russia's trading partners, such as Putin might also have to worry about and take into account. From this moment on, the Russians can focus exclusively on the war. The tantalizing mirage of a unilateral ceasefire, a freeze on the conflict lines has gone. The story of sanctions has gone. The idea of a meeting, a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky has gone. And, well, all that's left are more weapons supplied to Ukraine from the West in ever diminishing quantities, because everybody quietly understands and realizes that there just aren't enough to go around. So anyway, this is where we are today. Now, having got to this point, let me now turn to the military situation in Ukraine. And, well, there's been a fair amount of news, and perhaps the starting point is that it looks as if, according to Ukrainian reporting channels, that Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, which was at one point close to being closed down by the Ukrainian authorities, is once again under severe pressure. The Ukrainian authorities are becoming concerned, apparently, about the information that Deep State is providing, and there's some claims that it is again at risk of being closed down. And the reason that, of course, is happening is because the military situation, Ukraine's military situation, is deteriorating, and it is deteriorating rapidly. My own view is that this pressure on Deep State has been building for some weeks now, and I've already commented about the fact that the Ukrainians have been claiming counterattacks in all sorts of places, some of which are either ephemeral or in some cases imaginary. Some mapping projects have assumed that there must be something to these Ukrainian counterattacks, because Deep State, which has been an exceptionally reliable mapping project in the past, has been reporting on them. But the reality is, it is not such a reliable mapping project anymore. The fact that it is coming under pressure is further evidence of the deterioration in Ukraine's military position. Now, let's now talk about that, and let's go through the various areas on the front lines. Now, a few days ago, there were reports that the village of Yunakovka in Sumy region had been captured by the Russians. There's been no further news about that, so I'm going to make a guess that that news was wrong. I get the sense that the Russians and the Ukrainians have both now deprioritized the fighting in Sumy region. But in everywhere else, it is a story of Russian advance. Now, perhaps the most rapid Russian advance is happening in the West Donbass, Dnipropetrovsk, East Zaporozhye region, where apparently 3 Russian armies are operating and conducting a combined offensive. I don't know how many men that means, but I'm guessing we're talking about 30, 50,000 at least. Anyway, they are pushing remorselessly eastwards. And with every day that passes, there are reports that more and more villages are falling under Russian control, and that the Russians are approaching not just the important village of Veliko Mikhailovka, and are not only close to surrounding the other important village of Novopavlovka, which is located, by the way, west of Pokrovsk, southwest of Pokrovsk. But they're also approaching an important supply road that leads from the north to the Ukrainian town of Gulyapolye in the Zaporozhye region. Now, if the Russians cut this road, then supplies to the Ukrainians in Gulyapolye, and they're already encircled on effectively 3 sides, are cut. It's difficult to see how the Ukrainians can hold Gulyapolye. If they lose Gulyapolye, the pressure on Orekhov will become overwhelming, and if the Russian advance further north towards the river continues, then Orekhov anyway could soon find itself encircled, and, well, we could start to see the beginning of a collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Zaporozhye region, outside the city of Zaporozhye itself, which would at that point, of course, come under siege. So that battle is going on. I'm not going to pretend that I have followed it with any very great detail, but every day, including this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry, it seems, announces further advances in this area. It is absolutely like a steamroller, gradually trundling westwards, crushing all opposition that lies before it. Now, further north, in the Pokrovsk area, we have a lot of confusing information, and I'm going to make a guess that the single reason why Deep State may be in trouble is because the Ukrainians have been making many claims of successful counteroffensives in the Pokrovsk area. Zelensky has done this himself, but I suspect that most of those claims are untrue, and Deep State knows it, and that this is ultimately the cause of the tension. Anyway, there are two important battles simultaneously underway in the area of Pokrovsk. One is taking place within Pokrovsk itself and in the south and western areas of Pokrovsk. The other is in the northeast of Pokrovsk, in the area where the Russians carried out their breakthrough back in August. The reports of Ukrainian counterattacks that we've all been hearing are coming from this area of the breakthrough in northeast of Pokrovsk. There are supposedly huge encounter battles as the Ukrainians attempt to cut off the Russian forces in the breakthrough area or force them to fall back. Supposedly, many of Ukraine's best brigades are located in this area. Virtually everybody acknowledges that the Ukrainians are suffering very heavy losses precisely in this area. And, well, I have to say this, the Ukrainians claim all sorts of major victories, but the Russians deny it. And Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which has apparently been very well informed about the situation in the Pokrovsk area, is saying that all of the Ukrainian attacks in this area have been repelled, that the Ukrainians have not been able to throw the Russians back in the breakthrough area. So this is where the main battle appears to be taking place. It's difficult to get an exact picture of what is going on because neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, I've noticed, are providing much or indeed anything in the way of video footage. I ought to say that, in my opinion, if the Ukrainians were indeed making progress, they would certainly be doing so. So that tends to bear out the Russian claims that they are not. But anyway, one way or the other, there does seem to be a lot of fighting, bitter fighting in this area. But my impression overall is that the Ukrainians are stuck, that they're suffering very, very heavy losses, and that they're not making very much progress. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I received a private email from a source who described in detail how the Russians are using the Battle of Pokrovsk to conduct another meat grinder operation on the Ukrainian forces. And it looks to me like all the fighting northeast of Pokrovsk is consistent with that. But it also does something else, which is that it is diverting Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian brigades, away from engaging the Russians inside Pokrovsk itself. And this is the second battle. Because according to Radovka, the Russians are now making considerable progress inside Pokrovsk. They've captured the Udachne, the village to the southwest of Pokrovsk. They've reached the Pokrovska mine, the big mine that produces the coke and coal. And Radovka has now published a map which it says shows who controls what inside Pokrovsk, and the map shows practically the entirety of western Pokrovsk, the whole of Pokrovsk, west of Pokrovsk, now under Russian control. It also shows the Russians in control of pretty much the entire stretch of the E50 road inside Pokrovsk, and also of a northern road, a smaller road that enters Pokrovsk from the north, directly from the village of Grishino. So if this is correct, then the Ukrainians are fighting a major battle northeast of Pokrovsk, even as they are actually losing Pokrovsk. The Russians are at the center, they're at the west, they're north of the railways in the western part of Pokrovsk. They've cut off all the key supply roads, and the situation of the Ukrainian troops in southeastern Pokrovsk is desperate, and they are in effect in a cauldron. Now, I am not there. I don't know whether these claims by Radovka are true. But as I have discussed many times, especially in relation to the Pokrovsk fighting, Radovka tends to be true. When they've made claims, subsequent events have tended to corroborate them. Now, further east, there's still a lot of fighting going on in and around Konstantinovka. The Russians are steadily improving their positions. They've released video footage of a raft crossing the Kliban-Bek reservoir. It looks like an automated raft, seeking to send supplies to Ukrainian troops south of the Kliban-Bek reservoir. It looks as if all attempts to evacuate these troops south of the Kliban-Bek reservoir, Gerasimov and other Russian sources have claimed that they're surrounded, that they're in a cauldron, and that there are roughly 3,000 of them. It looks as if all of these troops, these 3,000 troops, are in effect completely cut off, and that the Ukrainians are trying to resupply them. All attempts to evacuate them up to now have been unsuccessful. I don't know how long this battle south of the Kliban-Bek reservoir will continue, but elsewhere in the Konstantinovka area, there are more reports of the Russians clearing more positions as the siege of Konstantinovka grows tighter. The most dramatic news, however, continues to come from the north and the northeast. There is now clear video footage, which to my mind appears to confirm that fighting of some kind is indeed happening in the industrial suburbs of Seversk. Gerasimov said that fighting was going on within the metropolitan area of Seversk, and it does indeed seem to be underway. Radovka itself is claiming that the Ukrainians are now pushed back to the southern suburbs of Kupiansk, and that they're evacuating their people in Kupiansk from the east bank of the Oskol River, and that they're preparing to evacuate Kupiansk entirely in order to try to reinforce the defenses of the strategically important town of Izium and the nearby town of Balakleya, which the Russians controlled in 2022, but which the Ukrainians recaptured during the 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive, and the fall of which would lead to the cutting off of supplies to the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation from the north, even as supplies through Pokrovsk are cut off to that conurbation from the south and west. And there's also further reports of more Russian advances in areas around Liman. It looks like the Russians now have open ground between their forces and Liman itself, and an attack on Liman is likely to come at some point within the next few days or weeks at most. Now, this is what we know. The realities probably are much worse for the Ukrainians than these reports say. I suspect that the situation in Pokrovsk for the Ukrainians is becoming critical. And as I said already, I believe that the tensions between deep state and the Ukrainian authorities are because the people at deep state are becoming frustrated that they're not allowed to disclose the true situation in Pokrovsk. So there we are. The Russians have a clear route to pursue a military victory, and that is exactly what they're doing. I don't think that this is reversible. I think Donald Trump knows it. I think that he is not going to fall for this ruse of the supposed drone attacks by the Russians on Poland. His Truth Social post about this, I think, all but said as much. I mean, it was extraordinarily sarcastic, if I have to say it. I mean, what Trump said was basically that why are the Russians, here we go, the Russians are again, what's with Russia violating Poland's airspace with drones, ? Here we go. I mean, to me, that looks like a question. What's the sense, what's the logic behind all this? And here we go. He expects to get, in other words, the same litany from the Europeans, the Ukrainians, about the Russians about to conquer the whole of Europe, the Russian bear on the prowl, and all of that, all preparatory to them taking out the begging bowls and asking him and the United States for more money and more weapons and more sanctions, none of which ultimately he's prepared to give. So I think, this is my own personal view, that from this point on, at least for the time being, the diplomacy is basically over. When the three cities fall, when Donbass falls, when the Russians are at the gates of Zaporozhye, there's a report, by the way, that the Russians have also carried out a reconnaissance in force in Kherson, city of Kherson, that they landed a party of troops on the west bank of the river, of the Dnieper, and scouted around Kherson and found no Ukrainian defenders there, which may be a sign that some kind of cross-river operation by the Russians is indeed coming. We'll see. Anyway, I suspect that once Donbass has fallen, when the Russians are at the gates of Zaporozhye, when perhaps they have reoccupied Kherson again, if they really do intend to cross the river, then at that point some kind of diplomatic activity will resume. But for the moment, at least, the Russians have an open run. Well, it's perhaps unsurprising because in Europe, the political situation continues to deteriorate. President Macron of France, of course, refuses to resign. He's just appointed his defense minister and political ally, Sébastien Lecornu, the new French prime minister. I can't imagine why he believes that Lecornu will be any more successful than Barnier and Bayrou and all of the others were. All he is doing by remaining in place or by refusing to appoint a socialist as prime minister or by calling elections is that he's prolonging the political crisis in France. My own guess is that the Le Cornu appointment is basically his last throw if or when Le Cornu falls. Macron himself will be left out in the open, and at that point his position will become untenable, and a forced resignation in that case is not impossible. But we still have a certain amount of way to go before we reach that point. Whilst in Britain's utterly incompetent, completely hapless Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has just suffered another major political blow against opposition from many within his own party. He appointed Tony Blair's spin doctor, Peter Mandelson, Britain's ambassador to the United States. It turns out that Peter Mandelson was a close friend, a deep and trusting friend of none other than Jeffrey Epstein. It seems that he stayed with Epstein in Epstein's New York mansion, even after Epstein had pleaded guilty to charges, which seems incredible. Keir Starmer apparently knew all about that, and being, of course, an entirely naive man and innocent abroad about these things. After all, he was only Britain's chief criminal prosecutor for about 10 years, so you mustn't expect too much from him in terms of these sort of matters. Anyway, in spite of all of that, Keir Starmer nonetheless appointed Peter Mandelson Britain's ambassador to Washington, from which perch Mandelson also was able to continue to give Keir Starmer political advice. Well, the Epstein revelations have now forced Starmer to sack Mandelson. And, of course, unsurprisingly, criticism of Starmer continues to grow. So Europe completely in a mess. The drone incident, I predict, will be forgotten in a few days. The war continues, but it continues in a sense where the trajectory is clear. And of course, in America, we've had this terrible news about the killing of Charlie Kirk. Well, this is where I'm going to end today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.